Welcome to another one of my videos. You can help support this channel by subscribing and liking, and by grabbing the free ebook that goes along with this audiobook. You can find the link to the free ebook in the upper right hand corner or in the description. Today's story is the first book in the AaBack's Grimm series. It's a dark fantasy fairy tale. And the title of the book is AaBack's Grimm, Dark Fantasy Fairy Tale Number 1, Tale of Two Worlds, The Wizard, the Battle Mage, and the Werewolf. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the read.
AaBack's Grimm, Dark Fantasy Fairy Tale Number 1, Tale of Two Worlds, The Wizard, the Battle Mage, and the Werewolf, by Kristie Lynn Higgins. Copyright 2015-2020. Chapter 1. The Dream. For the few moments the dream lingered within her mind like starlight near day's twilight, Jane didn't know if her mind fancy had been a long-forgotten memory that recently returned to her when she entered her teens, or if the dream was only a wishful hope and yet a horrible reminder of the life she existed in. Through the first part of her adult life and into her early 30s, the dream remained the same and never differed, and each time she dreamed the occurrence, she experienced each moment as if it was for the first time, and she never remembered what was coming until she was swept into it. It always began with herself as a young child walking through a scary forest she didn't recognize. She wore blue shorts and a black t-shirt with a pretty white swan on it. Jane never remembered how she happened to be in the forest or why she was alone at such a young age. The dense forest was frighteningly dark, with only glimmers of light here and there, along with large fireflies the size of her fists that seemed to crackle with blue lightning. She felt so lost as creatures angrily squawked or roared around her. She slowly made her way through the thick underbrush for what seemed like a long time, and then she began to feel isolated and deeply alone. Despair seized her and wrapped her up in its cold embrace, and it would have dragged her even deeper into hopelessness and made her give up on ever finding her way out if a bright light hadn't have broken through the dark canopy. The sunbeam beckoned her to it, so Jane climbed her way over roots, pushed her way through shrubs and bushes until she broke free of the forest, and came upon a bright sunny clearing. There in the clearing was a small pond, and she saw herself in its reflection. Dirt and leaves covered her and made her appear like a little mud elf with pointed ears, but she didn't care. She was free of the creepy trees. Voices drew her over a hill and into a small meadow valley where a boy and a girl played. Jane was a little younger than the two children, who looked to be about 5, and for some reason, Jane got the impression the two weren't siblings. The boy and the girl turned to Jane as she stood on the hill above them near tears. They peered at her for a long time, and Jane was afraid they might run away or, even worse, pretend she wasn't even there. The blonde boy seemed like some sort of prince from a fairy tale, with the purple garb and the gold crown he wore. Jane noticed a medallion around his neck of some sort of beastly creature. The girl with long black hair was beautiful like a princess. She had on a flurry white dress with red roses vining all over it, and she had a blue birthmark under her left eye in the shape of a double lightning bolt. Jane stared back at them as curiously as they peered up at her. She looked down at herself, remembered how dirty she had gotten in the forest, and wondered what she must look like to them. Jane wanted to run to them and grab hold of them as if they had been friends for years, but she was afraid to move because, for some reason, she feared if she did, they would disappear. The boy and the girl looked at each other, and then they both held out their hand for her to come and join them. A tear of extreme joy trickled down her cheek as she ran to them and grabbed their hands. The next part of the dream was a little fuzzy. Jane did get a sense that the boy and the girl accepted her and that they played for a long time together in the meadow. She wished with all her heart she could stay in those joyous and yet unclear moments forever. Jane experienced feelings she lacked in her normal life, and she didn't want to let go. Not of the family she always longed for. She wasn't sure what the feelings she experienced were, but she wanted more of them. Later that day, the dream became clearer as the children found a patch of wildflowers, and they were unlike any plants Jane had seen. The wildflowers pranced under the sun like little river dancers, and if one of the children tapped the head of the bloom, a bloom smaller than the host plant fell into their palm. Each smaller bloom had a stem. The girls giggled and played with the plants as the boy mostly chased the girls around. After some time, the three of them sat for a while to rest from their play, and the girl gathered some of the tiny blooms from a rainbow of different colored flowers and began twisting the stems together. When she finished, the girl whispered something to the item in her hand, and blue sparks shot up from her palm. Then she gently took Jane's hand and put a tiny flower loop on her finger. Jane peered at the friendship ring as the circlet made from nature went from one of green and rainbow to one of heart and silver. The magical silver ring sealed the bond between the two girls deep within Jane's heart, and then she hugged the girl in return. The boy felt left out and came over and stole a kiss from Jane's lips, expressing his own feelings towards her. Jane blushed and her heart fluttered, and then she looked at her new friends and knew the bond they had could never be broken by time or distance. Their love and affection poured into her so much, Jane thought her chest would explode. Storm clouds moved in and forced the children to seek shelter in an old temple-like structure a short distance from the meadow in a not-so-scary woods. Torches lit up the all-white structure. Statues of different monsters decorated the vast room within, and Jane and the other children walked around looking at each. In the center of the temple, one statue was set apart. The statue was of a man in armor wielding a shield and sword. Awed and mesmerized by the hero, Jane read the inscription below the statue, Monster Slayer. There was a wall behind the statue of the hero with words on it that Jane didn't recognize. The boy and girl seemed to be able to read it, and then the boy and the girl shrunk from the statue of the hero, and Jane wasn't sure why. They moved to a different part of the temple, exploring as they went, but there was nothing else to find. The storm outside increased its furiousness as its winds kicked up, and lightning blazed across the sky. Jane wasn't scared because the other two were with her, but the girl was in when one of the bolts struck the ground outside. The girl backed up into one of the smaller monster statues and teetered it. The statue rocked back and forth, and then it fell forward. Jane, the girl, and the boy ran as the statue crashed to the ground, and Jane tripped and fell. She looked back and saw no one else was hurt, so she stood and brushed the dirt off of herself. Her knee stung, so Jane glanced down to see she scuffed it up, and it slightly bled. A trickle of red plasma ran down her leg. The air around the temple seemed to change as if the structure itself gasped. The love and affection she genuinely and profoundly experienced from the other children vanished. As Jane lifted her gaze, she saw the boy and the girl's terrified faces. She thought maybe the statue crashing or the storm raging outside was what made them afraid. But when she took a step toward them, they both backed up from her as if she was a snarling, ravenous beast who wanted to devour them. Jane thought they were playing some sort of trick on her, and she laughed as they pretended to be afraid of her. The girl grabbed the boy's hand and squeezed it as she took another step away from Jane. The boy moved forward as if to defend the girl, and at that point, Jane realized their fear was real and it was directed at her. Their love and friendship had been violently and fearfully torn away from her in one confused, agonizing heartbeat, and a little part of Jane died in that devastating instant. Tears rolled from her eyes, spawned from a deeply seated ache like the pain of abandonment, and they were also spawned from the painful act of betrayal as the bond they shared broke apart. This world was just like the world she had come from. The boy turned and dragged the girl after him as they fled the temple. Jane ran after them as far as the exit, and then she watched heartsick as they disappeared into the storm. She put a hand to her little chest as the muscle that had been ready to explode with childlike delight broke and shattered into tiny pieces, as the world she had grown accustomed to invaded the realm of her dreams. Jane went into a corner of the temple and sat down as she bawled. She cried for a long time, and as the storm settled outside, she realized what the feelings she experienced before had been, the ones she never wanted to let go, the ones that had been stolen from her. They were a sense of belonging, the kind of belonging where people knew and remembered you and where they would never turn their backs on you. The dream faded, and Jane woke to her life as an adult. There were heartache and pain within the dream, but there were also joy and friendship, and Jane longed to return to that world even with its suffering, as long as she was allowed to relive the fun and happy moments with her friends. As the mind fancy faded from her memory once again, she was left with a sense that something had been taken away from her. Jane laid back in bed and stared up at the ceiling of her small cottage. She knew she had a dream, but no matter how hard she tried to remember even just fragments of it, it was no good. The only consolation Jane had was that she thought that day was the first day she dreamed the dream. It might have been maddening to repeat the mind fancy each night and remember every part of it only to have it taken away again. Jane gazed at her ceiling, relinquishing her attempt to drag the memories from her mind. She thought about her real life, and it seemed at times optimism was the only thing that belonged to her. She knew she could change her life. Jane just needed to press forward and not give up. Chapter 2. A day in the life of Jane. Jane hummed to herself as she entered the publishing house she worked for, carrying a box she had purchased from the local bakery. She had her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore blue jeans, a gray Superman t-shirt, and sneakers. She would do it today. Jane would have at least one person remember her name, and a sweet bribe would do the trick. She passed several people as she headed for the receptionist area as she greeted each of them by name. They didn't return her greeting, seemingly busy about their own work. Jane reached the receptionist desk, placed the box of goodies on a table to the right of the receptionist desk where a coffee machine was set up, and opened the box. a dozen donuts laid inside. The receptionist was on the phone, so Jane waited until she hung up. There was another woman there, and she was fixing herself a cup of coffee. "I've brought donuts today, and I got your favorite, Debbie. You better grab the Bavarian cream before someone else does," Jane told the receptionist, and then she spoke to the woman putting sugar in her coffee. "I even got your favorite, Karen. Cinnamon Twist is also one of my favorites. Eat them while they're still fresh." With a big smile on her face, Jane looked from one woman to the other, waiting for some sort of reply from them, but when none came, she said, "My name's Jane. I work on this floor." The two women continued to look at her blankly, so Jane reached into the box, grabbed a chocolate donut she had purchased for herself, and headed for her office. She yelled over her shoulder, "Don't forget, eat them while they're fresh." After she left, Karen turned to Debbie and questioned her. "Who was that?" "I'm not sure," Debbie replied as she turned and glanced in Jane's direction as she headed through a hallway. A fog seemed to cover Debbie's memory of the woman who had brought donuts, and as time went on, more and more of the phantom-like woman faded from her mind. Debbie added, "She acted like she knew us. I wonder who she could be." Karen questioned her, "Don't you think you should call security? You just can't have anybody walking around the building." Debbie reached for the phone, then paused as the fog magically lifted a bit, and Debbie said, "I think that woman works here. I just can't remember her name." "She must not have worked here very long," Karen said. "I don't remember seeing her before. The odd thing was that she knew both of our names. She should really introduce herself or no one will know who she is." A man walked up to the desk and asked, "Who are you talking about?" "What do you mean?" Debbie uttered, looked at the other woman who also didn't have a clue what the man was talking about, and then she honestly answered, "We weren't talking about anyone." Jane continued on to her office where she worked as an illustrator. She took a bite of her donut and found it hard to swallow as she got a little choked up over her failed attempt to break what seemed like a curse. She put a lot of effort in selecting the donuts and spent weeks figuring out what the people on the floor favored. Jane remembered the look they gave her, the familiar gaze that bore no recognition in it, and she knew to them she was nothing but a stranger. She was lucky this time they didn't call security on her. The loneliness of never connecting with anyone plagued her life, but she wouldn't let it win. Jane would find a way to break the wall that surrounded her that hid her from everyone, and once she broke free of it, someone would remember her. Jane felt she should have friends and was determined to make them. It had been 5 years since she started the job as an illustrator, and she loved the work she did for the company. She mostly worked on art for children's fairy tales, and her artwork hung all over her office. She currently worked on a version of Beauty and the Beast for one of the company's popular authors. She finished eating her chocolate donut, then walked over to the sink and washed her hands. Her office was equipped with a small kitchenette, one of the perks of being one of the top illustrators for the company. She had the perfect job and loved what she did, but she couldn't seem to connect with anyone. Jane's affliction, as she sometimes referred to it, tormented her since she was a child. The world around her seemed to disconnect from her, or was it that she was disconnected from them? She didn't know, but tried not to let it bother her too much. Jane hoped one day her life would change. She went and sat at her desk and started again on a drawing of a stained glass window with an old woman in it holding a rose. It was one of the opening illustrations for the book. Jane went about her workday and greeted everyone she came across. She knew everyone's name, but they mostly looked at her as if they had no clue who she was. Jane always wondered if they were just being rude or truly didn't recognize her. Sometimes Jane wondered if she was cursed like one of the characters in the fairy tales. Jane put the final touches on the drawing of the old woman, then peered at the character's face, and felt something was missing. She twirled a small silver ring around her left pinky as she thought about it a little more. Jane knew something was missing, but she couldn't put a pin on it. She decided she would come back to the character tomorrow after she had a good night's rest, and see if the Mia item would come to her then. Jane leaned back in her chair and stared at the ring of intertwined tiny flowers she fidgeted with, sensing there was something she couldn't remember. It always seemed like there was something she couldn't remember. Standing and stretching, Jane decided she would take a short break and walk around her office. Hundreds of drawings from dozens of fairy tales filled her walls, but her most precious drawing she kept in a scrapbook, and she went and flipped through it. 2 characters dominated the book. One was of a red rose, though Jane couldn't figure out why she insisted what usually was an item or prop in the children's stories was a character. The other character was, well, hey. Jane flipped through the pages of his drawings, and many of them focused on his feral blue-green eyes, and much more of the drawings focused on his lips. She slammed the book shut as she blushed. Jane found if she wasn't careful, she would be drawn into the make-believe world. She smoothed her hand over the cover. Sometimes she felt these fictitious people were the only friends she had. Jane sighed, then went back over to her desk and started on a new drawing of a man wielding an axe. Hours went by as she sketched, and then an alarm went off on her phone. The alarm told her it was time to stop. If she forgot to set the alarm, Jane found she would work through the night, drawn into the world she sketched. Jane hit snooze, put some finishing touches on the drawing, then stood as her alarm went off again. She tidied up her workstation and headed out as she always did, and just as she was leaving, Karen and Debbie were also heading out the door. "Hello," Karen said. "Are you new here?" "Not really. My name's Jane. I'm one of the illustrators." "Oh," Karen replied back. "Hey, new girl," Debbie began. "We're going out to dinner. Do you want to come along?" Jane was about to tell her again that she wasn't new at all, but when Debbie actually invited her somewhere, she quickly forgot about the correction and replied, "I'm in." She searched her person and found that she had forgotten her wallet that she usually kept in her pocket. It was on her desk back in her office. "I just need to go get my credit card." She ran off, quickly collected the wallet, placed it in her jeans back pocket, and rushed back to the exit of the building. Karen and Debbie were waiting there along with 2 other guys and another woman. "I'm ready to go," Jane told them. Debbie looked at her as if she had no clue what she was talking about. And then Debbie said, "Ready to go where?" "To whatever restaurant we're going to." "I think this is the first time you've invited me anywhere," Jane told them. "Who invited you to come?" Debbie asked her as she looked at the other 4 people. A few of them shrugged as a few more glanced around as if they had no clue. "You did," Jane answered her. "You invited me to go out to eat with you." Karen was standing right there. Jane turned to Karen and asked her, "You heard her invite me, right?" Debbie and Karen were notably getting upset as the conversation progressed. Karen replied, "I don't know when Debbie was supposed to invite you, but I didn't hear a thing." She turned to Debbie and questioned her. "Maybe you invited her before. Did you invite her earlier in the day and forgot about it?" "I think I would remember inviting someone," Debbie told her. "I don't even know your name, but that doesn't matter. I wouldn't care if you came, but my car is full now with the 5 of us. Maybe next time you can come." The 5 of them started out the door as Jane watched them leave. She had flashbacks of when she was a child. She clearly remembered children on the playground who would invite her to join in on their game, and when she would start playing with them, they would look at her like they had no clue why she was joining in. Even the different foster parents Jane had over the years would sometimes look at her like she had broken into their house, and she was either there to vandalize their stuff or steal their food. Most of the time that unperceiving look went away before it became a serious problem, but one time, Jane had to convince one couple to call the child welfare place to prove to them that they were her foster parents instead of the police. Because people were always forgetting her, Jane never made any connections over the years, and it troubled her deeply, but she tried to keep an optimistic outlook on her future. She knew one day she would find someone who would connect with her and remember her, and that one day, she would find the perfect man who would love her and marry her. Jane rushed out the door after her co-workers and yelled at them, "I have my bike with me. I can ride it to whatever restaurant you're going to. Did you hear me? I can't." She watched as the group of 5 made their way to the parking lot, and either they didn't hear her or they pretended not to. Jane gave up, knowing trouble only followed if she persisted, so she headed for her bike and rode home. Jane gave herself a pep talk as she rode along. There was always tomorrow. She could try and connect with someone tomorrow. The town the publishing house was located in was small and on a mountain. Jane rented when she first moved to the town, but after about a year, she made enough from her illustrations to put a down payment on a small cottage in the woods and live there by herself. Many times she thought about getting a dog to help with the loneliness, but her long hours away from her home prevented her from ever going through with it. Jane stopped by the grocery store before heading home and carried a small bag in her backpack as she pedaled her mountain bike. When she reached home, she parked her bike just inside the door, grabbed the bag from the backpack, entered her kitchen, and made herself some homemade tomato soup and grilled cheese. She ate her supper, watched a little TV, and then headed to bed. Tomorrow was Saturday, and she would have the day off too. 2. She would find something to do with her time off. She put her pajamas on as she heard a rainstorm moving outside. She also noticed that the temperature inside the cottage had dropped a little. Jane was about to get into bed when she heard a knock at her door, so she cautiously went and answered it without opening the door. "Who is it?" "You do not know me." "I am an old woman," the voice on the other side replied. "I have lost my way, and it is cold and rainy out here. Could I come in and dry myself?" Jane had heard many stories over the years about strangers showing up and killing everyone in the house, and because of those stories, she was reluctant to let the person in. Jane moved to the window beside the door, pulled the curtains to the side, and saw the old woman who was dressed in a long, hooded purple robe with a gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her clothes were soaked, and she was shivering. She hated to turn the old woman away, but she was also afraid to let her in. "Did your car break down?" Jane asked, and then she said, "I can call a tow truck for you. I was walking. Would you please let me in? I'll call the police for you, and they can come pick you up and take you wherever you need to go." The old woman said, "I would prefer to come in and dry myself just a little while. I will be no trouble, and I can offer you a rose as payment for your troubles." Jane heard how cold the woman was and the desperation in her voice, and then the old woman started to cough, and it sounded bad. Jane decided she couldn't turn her away, so against her better judgment, she opened the door and let her in. The woman came in and seemed to float across the floor, and Jane also noticed she wore a half mask that covered the left side of her face and all of her forehead. The white mask looked like it was made of porcelain. Jane tried not to stare as she showed her to the kitchen table. Then she got the old woman several towels to dry off with, and she even plugged in a hairdryer to help dry her clothes and long gray hair. The woman gratefully gave her a long stem red rose that had yet to open, and Jane filled a glass vase with water and placed the bud in it. Jane warmed up the tomato soup and toasted a couple of pieces of bread for the old woman. The old woman gobbled the hot meal down gracefully, and then Jane decided she couldn't send her off into the rainstorm to get soaked again. So she offered her the living room couch, and the old woman gladly accepted. The two of them sat at the table, and Jane noticed over the course of the night the old woman peered at her unlike anyone had peered at her before. The old woman looked at her as if she recognized her, and this made Jane feel accepted and not so isolated from the world. The evening progressed, and it came time to go to bed, so she tucked the old woman in on the couch. Then Jane went to bed and for the first time, slept through the night without dreaming the dream. The next morning, she awoke to find that the old woman had left, and there was a note on the table written on some old parchment, and Jane read it. "You do have a kind heart, but your kindness only makes your world that much sadder. Take care to keep the light in your heart, for it is the only thing that will save you. It is the only thing that will save us all." Jane thought it was a little odd as a thank you note, but didn't linger on it too long. She found the rose sitting on the counter in its vase, and the bud had still to open. The cottage was quiet in a lonely way, so Jane decided that she would go for a bike ride. She ate breakfast, put on brown cargo shorts and a red t-shirt with the Flash logo on it, then prepared a small picnic for herself. She grabbed an extra t-shirt, placed it and the lunch in her backpack, and grabbed her bike. Jane opened the door and noticed that it was very foggy outside and that she couldn't see more than an arm span in front of her. She rolled her bike out across her gravel driveway and decided just to wait there a few minutes to see if the fog would start to break. But it didn't, so she turned around and headed back for her cottage. Jane would have to wait until the sun rose higher in the sky and burned away the fog. She rolled her bike in the cottage direction for a long time, and then she stepped off the gravel road a few feet and decided to pause as she never came to the structure or the wooden fence that surrounded her cottage. Now that Jane thought about it, she didn't remember ever passing her fence as she left the cottage. Jane decided that she shouldn't keep going and get herself lost or fall off the mountain, so she waited a while for the fog to let up. It seemed like a whole hour went by as she waited. Jane removed a sandwich from her picnic and took a couple of bites, and then the fog finally started to lift. She no longer stood near the gravel road. Actually, it and the cottage were nowhere in sight, and trees she didn't recognize surrounded her. Jane wondered where in the world she could be. She wrapped up the partially eaten sandwich, put it back in her backpack, and then thought about what she should do next. Jane removed her cell phone, but she had no signal. She was on her own, nothing new. Jane couldn't believe how lost she had gotten in so little time, and she decided she couldn't stay there. So she would climb higher up the mountain, that way she could figure out where the town was and then go from there. Jane turned her bike and pushed it up the mountain. Chapter 3. Once upon a time, a large oak door with ancient script inscribed within it led out to a large elongated cliff that overlooked most of the mountain and the valley below. Near the edge of the cliff, a pedestal the size of a large boulder and made of jagged green crystals held the coveted prize. An eagle's claw made of black steel rose from the crystal's center, with its claw reaching for the sky, and in its talons, it held a blue gem the size of a grapefruit. For centuries, the coveted prize known as the Tear of Power had led adventurers, thieves, power mongers, and the like into its dungeons below to seek fame, riches, or power. The gem had led thousands to their deaths as they fell prey to traps and monsters. Few survived the first 5 levels of the dungeon, and even fewer had made it past level 7. But 3 brave souls, urged on by greed, power, and heart, made it to the 13th floor and the final level. A commotion could be heard on the other side of the large oak door. It was the sounds of battle, one of steel, claws, teeth, and muscle, but also one of conjuration and magic. The commotion grew louder as the 3 brave souls fought the most powerful and final monster. A loud explosion shook the large, thick door, and then all fell to silence. A metal bowl could be heard unlocking from within. Then the door creaked open, and the 3 brave souls stepped out to claim their prize. The dungeon had taken its toll on them, marking them with scars from monsters and steel, and they were physically and mentally tired. They heaved for their exertion but pressed on to claim the coveted prize. A female crimson battle mage from the desert elf tribe was clothed in a hooded red cape, and she held a sword in her right hand and wielded a magic sphere the size of a baseball in her left. The magic sphere still zapped and discharged from her last attack in currents of red energy that swirled around its crystal mass. She took up the middle position of the 3 brave souls as they moved as one beast towards the tier of power. A woodlands elf wizard with a black beard and a hooded robe to match stood to her left and carried a staff with an axe blade attached. The top of his thick black hair smoldered after receiving a parting gift from the last monster. A werewolf in his semi-form stomped across the cliff on his 2 hind legs as his claws and teeth dripped with blood. The werewolf stood to the woman's right, and he reverted to his giant wolf form, which was the easiest of the 3 forms to possess. They stopped before the mound of green crystals and peered at the tier of power. The 3 of them hated each other, but over the countless years, they were unable to go the dungeon alone. So they made a pact. They banded together to clear the dungeon, and when they cleared the final monster, they would fight each other for the prize until there was only one victor. Without a word, they separated from each other and prepared to defeat the other 2. The female crimson battle mage known as Red Northland's Fury charged her magical sphere, and red energy crackled around it, then moved through her body, and also charged her sword. The woodlands elf wizard known as Woodsman of the Sacred Oak lifted his staff, and the axe blade glowed purple. The werewolf, Lycos of steel teeth, faced them as his eyes glowed yellow, and then he bared his large teeth and growled at the 2. Each one waited for the other to attack first. Far below the cliff, Jane emerged from the forest and found the entrance to the dungeon. She peered through the 2 open doors into its dark, foreboding opening and decided she wouldn't dare enter. Jane did need to find a high place to see where she was. The fog completely lifted, and she had walked for about 2 hours. She was about to continue on when she heard a loud howl and an explosive sound like thunder. A different type of detonating thunders followed, and the ground beneath her trembled. Angry shouts came from above, so Jane lifted her head, drawn to the sounds of the fight. She couldn't see on top of the cliff, but she did glimpse an object glinting in the sunlight right before it hit her in the eye. She cried out in shock and covered her right eye with her hand as a great pain shot throughout her body. The sting was so bad Jane thought she lost her eye. She searched the area around her eye with her fingers and discovered no blood, so her panic lessened. Jane didn't know how long she reeled in pain, but as suddenly as the object had hit her, the pain completely disappeared. When the assault from the sky first occurred, she let go of her bike, and it fell to the ground. Jane bent down, grabbed its handlebars, and straightened the bike back on its wheels. She thought it best to leave the area before anything else fell on her, and she still needed to find something she could examine her eye in. She thought about her cell phone and that it had a mirror app, so she started to pull it out of her pocket when she felt as if she wasn't alone. Jane turned around and saw a man, a woman, and a huge dog quickly running toward her. They all looked like they had been in a fight that none of them were winning, and their unusual clothes caused her to take a double take. "There is a female here," Red said when they were still some distance away from her. "The female appears to be a lowlands elf," Woodsman stated, and then he pointed out, "Look how rounded her ears are. Though I do not recognize her garb." Red told him, "Get her attention before she leaves. We need to speak with her." "You, there, female," Woodsman called out. "We are looking for the tier of—" "Do not tell her that," Red snapped at him. "She does not need to know what we are looking for." "How are we to ask her if she has seen it if we do not tell her what we are looking for?" Woodsman questioned. "Like this," Red replied, and then she said, "You, there, female. Have you seen a shiny rock that may or may not have fallen off the cliff?" Lycos sniffed the air while the other 2 of them talked, then moved, and circled Jane. He smelled something familiar about her. Actually, he smelled 2 things that were very familiar to him. He started to warn the others when the woman reached down and petted his head. "You're such a huge dog," Jane told him, and then she said to the others, "I don't know what it was, but something did hit me in the head. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jane, and I seem to be lost. I am Woodsman of the Sacred Oak," the woodlands elf wizard said as he puffed out his chest. He motioned to the female crimson battle mage and stated, "The ill-tempered creature beside me is called Red Northland's Fury, and that fleabag wolf over there is Lycos of steel teeth." Jane looked over their costumes and questioned them. "Are all of you going to a fantasy convention or something?" "Convention," Red repeated. "The Crimson Battle Mage Convention is not until the end of the year. I am surprised you have heard of it." "I actually haven't," Jane replied. "Oh, since you're here, can you look into my eye?" I got something in it earlier. Red paid no attention to her, waved away the female's inquiry, and said, "You seem fine." "Thanks," Jane told her. "Maybe you can help me with something else." "I can't get a signal out here," she said, and then she questioned them. "Do any of you have cell phone reception?" "I can't call out or text." Woodsman leaned to the female Crimson Battle Mage and whispered, "She must be talking about the Great Warlock's cell phoneception. Maybe she is an apprentice of his. Look at the bolt she boasts on her garb. She may be a very powerful magic user, apprentice of the Great Warlock's cell phoneception or not. If this is so, we should talk no more of the Tear of Power in front of her." Red whispered back to him, and then she told her, "We are unable to assist you, and we should be on our way." "Wait," Jane uttered. "At least, direct me towards the nearest town." "AaBack is on the other side of the mountain," Woodsman told her. "There is a path over there," he said as he motioned with his staff. "Just follow it down." Woodsman and Red started in the opposite direction, searching the ground around the dungeon, looking for the large gem that eluded them. "Thanks," Jane said, and then she pushed her bike towards the path. She walked about 10 feet when she heard the most marvelous and amazing thing. "Jane," someone called after her. Her heart thundered in her chest. Someone remembered her name. She couldn't recall a time when someone remembered her name beyond a few seconds. Had the miracle she always prayed for finally happened? She turned, overcome by joy, and exclaimed, "Yes!" The woman and the man searched the ground a great distance from her, and they had their backs to her, so they couldn't have been the ones to speak unless they were playing some sort of joke. Jane wondered if she imagined that someone called to her. She may be a bit dehydrated and tired from pushing her bike up a rugged mountain. She shrugged, then turned, and headed for the path again. "Jane, wait. There is something I need to tell you." She turned again, completely sure she heard her name. The large dog moved toward her and spoke again, and this time, she saw his lips move. "Jane, heed my words. I don't know how you happened into this world. Maybe you came here as I did. It does not matter. You must listen to me very carefully. You're in danger here. It would be better if you didn't go down to the village, at least not the village of AaBack. The others don't know what you truly are, but I can smell you. I know what you are, and you must not let anyone else know." She peered at the large dog, and the only thing she could think of to say after his warning was, "You spoke. You actually talked. Is this some sort of trick?" "It's no trick," Lycos told her, and then he whispered, "I was once what you are. Luckily a werewolf bit me and changed me, or they would have killed me. I could bite you and change you too, but only on a night when the moon's full. We're weeks away from that. It would be better if you went into hiding until then. You could go into the dungeon and hide. We have cleared it of the monsters, but you would still need to be wary of the traps. I see your lips moving like on a movie or video, but how are they doing it out here?" She questioned. "Are you some sort of 3D projection?" "No, you can't be. I touched you. How are you talking?" "Jane, you must listen. Your life depends on it. Don't go down to." "What is going on here, female?" Red interrupted as she and the Woodlands elf wizard walked over to them. "I thought you were going to go down to AaBack and look for your master, Great Warlock's cell phoneception." "I think you misunderstood me," Jane stated, and then she changed the subject by asking, "Did you find the item you were looking for?" "No, we did not," Woodsman replied. "We believe someone may have run off with it." "Did you see anyone else down here?" Jane replied, "I didn't." Lycos sniffed the air again, and he realized the other thing he had caught scent of earlier was the Tear of Power. He remembered the woman said that she had gotten something in her eye, so he took a step forward and peered into her brown orbs. At first, he saw nothing, but as he gazed closer with his enhanced werewolf vision, he saw the Tear of Power embedded deep within her pupil. He wanted the gem as badly as the other two, and as he glanced in their direction, he realized the woman was in greater jeopardy in her current situation. Lycos scanned the area, and then he asked, "Are those troll tracks?" "Where?" Red uttered. "I see them now." "They are. I am going to follow them." She took off into the forest as Woodsman shouted, "I am coming with you." Lycos waited a few moments, and then he told Jane, "If you are to make AaBack before dark, maybe you should be on your way." "Oh, you're right. I'll walk with you a bit," he said, "just until you can see the village." "Thank you." The two of them headed for the path and followed it down. Jane waited a few minutes, then turned to Lycos and questioned him, "Do you know who I am?" "I know what you are," he answered. "I tried to explain to you earlier that you're in mortal danger." "No, I don't mean that. I'm not sure what you were talking about earlier, but I want to know if you know my name." "I do. It's Jane." "Why do you ask?" "I can't remember a time when someone did remember me. It's like I've been cursed, but I would have to say that all of this is weird. I'm talking to a large dog. Or I guess you said you were a werewolf. Talking to you in itself is very unusual. I think I'm dreaming. I'm having a weird and yet amazing dream." Lycos considered what she had told him, and then he said, "You were cursed before you came here. Our arrival here is very rare, and among the stories I've come across, I've never heard of one who's been cursed before coming here. I need to look into this anomaly a little more before we go through with making you as I am now. There is time. The full moon happens once a month, and it will appear again in about 3 weeks. You keep talking about making me a werewolf, but you never asked me if I wanted to become one. What am I saying? This is all a dream, and if I'm dreaming, does it mean I secretly want to be turned into a werewolf? I don't think so. I think I would want to be turned into a unicorn before that, she said, giggled, and then added, "Isn't that childish?" She thought about it some more, laughed again, then returned to the subject by repeating, "I don't want to become a werewolf. You'll change your mind when you understand everything," Lycos told her, peered ahead, then turned back to her, and said, "I must leave you now. You can see AaBack in the distance. Go to the bakery and speak with the muffin man. Make him give you a job. His shop is located on—" "Let me guess," she interrupted. "Drury Lane." "Yes, how did you know?" "It's my dream," Jane told him. "And my world was full of fairy tales before I came here." "What do you mean?" "I'm an illustrator, so I have to do extensive research before I start a drawing." "I didn't mean that," Lycos said. "Why did you mention fairy tales?" She answered, "I guessed your story after I heard each of your names, and so I know which character each of you really are." "Who are we?" Jane replied, "Everything's different, way different. But I'm sure, the woman's Little Red Riding Hood. The man and you were easy. He's the woodsman, and you're the wolf. You can see, I've never met anyone who picks up on curses." "You mean there's more to it?" Jane questioned. "There is. Try to figure it out," Lycos told her. "I have a feeling you may be more than you appear to be." "It's my dream," she said. "I'm supposed to be the hero." "A hero? Ha! Maybe you will be," Lycos stated. And then he said, "The muffin man will work you hard. But he's fair. Remember, don't leave his shop until he gives you a job." "Okay. Anything else I should know?" Jane questioned. "You aren't dreaming. I thought the same thing when I came here. The sooner you believe that, the sooner you can come to terms with your new reality. Remember, it isn't safe here in the World of Grimm. I would tell you more, but as you will find out, curses place certain limitations on the bearer." He caught another glimpse of the tear of power in her right eye and knew her destiny had been written much different than his. "Before you go, do me one favor," she said. "What's that?" "Say my name once more. Say my name every time we meet." "I will, Jane. I will," Lycos spoke, then turned, going after the other two he sent on a wild troll hunt. She watched him leave and wondered about everything he told her. Jane didn't feel like she was in a dream, but this world couldn't be real. It was all too crazy. She started down the path again, heading for the village. Jane thought about dream versus reality. It was crazy enough if it was a dream, but reality. Guess she would find out once she arrived at AaBack. Chapter 4. The Muffin Man. A sign lost to time and equally lost to a few weeds announced to Jane that she had reached her destination with the faded word AaBack on one posted sign, and on the posted sign below it was written Village of the Yaman Slayer. Jane noticed that the name AaBack had large spaces between the uppercase A, the lowercase a, and the word back, like a child had written them who didn't know how to space properly. She also considered that maybe there had been other letters or words there at some time. She rubbed her hand over the area and felt there had been something there before, but she just shrugged it off and continued on. She wondered what a yaman was and then mounted her bike now that there was level ground she could ride on, and she pedaled to the village. Jane quickly found Drury Lane and the bakery, parked her bike, and then entered the shop that delightfully smelled of fresh bread and pastries. "Hello," she called out. "Muffin Man." "What do you want?" a deep voice asked from behind her. She turned, looked down, and found a red-bearded dwarf with blue-gray eyes wearing a white apron and chef's hat with Tasty Dwarf Bakery written on them. Jane realized her dream was only going to get weirder, so she might as well get used to it. She remembered her first mission and told him, "I've come for a job. If that is what you seek, you have come to the wrong place," the dwarf told her as he passed her. "I have all the employees I can stand." "Really, I was told I should get a job here and to take no for an answer." "I mean not to take no for an answer." He stroked his red braided beard as he gave her a once-over, and then he said, "My latest delivery guy never showed." "Can you travel great distances in a short period of time?" "I can." Muffin Man peered at her again, and then he said, "I'll hire you on a trial basis. You have a deal. Will I be delivering your wares?" "You will," Muffin Man told her. "You mentioned he was your latest delivery guy. Do you have a problem finding loyal workers?" "No, they are usually the ones who have a problem. They have a problem keeping their lives. The last two were eaten, and the one before them disappeared on his way to a delivery. He was one to mess with female magic users, so Bob probably got turned into something." "Oh," Jane exclaimed as she made a face, and then she asked, "Is anyone else hiring in town?" Yeah, the witch in the forest is looking for someone to help lure children into her gingerbread house. She quickly put her hand out and said, "Good to work for you, boss." "Boss, ha," the dwarf remarked as he scratched his pudgy nose. "I like the sound of that." She dropped her hand after he didn't shake it, and then she asked, "What kind of pay do I get?" "A couple of muffins from the bakery and 1 halfpenny coin a day plus tips." "A halfpenny? Will that get me a room?" He laughed before he answered, "Maybe 500 of them if you don't mind living down in a smelly sewer with even more smellier giant rats." "That does put a pickle in things," Jane spoke. "All I have is a credit card, and I'll need a place to stay with a warm bed and a bath." "You can stay in the loft of the old barn out back," he told her as he threw his thumb over his shoulder. "As for a bath, there's a bathing house next door. Cost you 2 pennies. "A bath every 4 days?" Jane muttered to herself. "I hope tips are good or that this dream ends before I start to stink." Muffin Man said, "Well, let's get you started. Right now. I was hoping to begin tomorrow. Isn't it a bit late for deliveries?" "No, you still have a few hours before it starts to get dark." "Do you think because you work for a bakery all your hours will be in the wee morning?" He questioned her and then went to the back of his shop. "I thought it was much later than that, but I guess with dreams." He returned with a brown paper bag and a clipboard, and then he told her, "There's a castle on the hill above this village. Make the delivery and get the owner's signature. This is very important. Get his signature. Without it, I can't bill him, and you need to be back before dark if you want this job." "Got it," she said as she took the paper bag which contained a wooden box. Jane placed them in her backpack and grabbed the clipboard and quill. And then she asked, "The address?" "You don't need one. It's the only thing up Tall Hill Road except for maybe a dragon or a troll." She noticed the writing utensil and inquired, "Don't I need ink for this quill?" "It's enchanted with infinite ink, so don't lose it and to answer your next question." "Yes, the cost would come out of your paycheck, and it would take you 10,000 years, working 7 days a week to repay me if you do lose it, so don't." He looked over her unusual garb and questioned her, "You do have a weapon, right?" "Ah, no. Do you think I'll need one?" He exhaled loudly as he shook his head and mumbled, "The younger generation, never prepared." He went in the back room, then returned, held out the weapon, and said, "Here." She took the wooden club with a leather strap at its end and examined the teeth and claw marks all over the wood. "The last 2 delivery boys carried that," Muffin Man told her as he folded his small arms and nodded as if approving of the choice. "Should make you a fine weapon." Jane laughed at how her dream was turning out, and then she remarked, "Great weapon. It worked wonders for my predecessors." "Better hurry," he told her, and then he warned her, "Don't want to be on Tall Hill Road after dark." "Maybe you should show me where I'll be living before I go," she suggested. "No, I'll wait. I don't want to go through the hassle if you're only going to end up dead." "Great pep talk, boss," Jane replied with a smile, attached the club to her backpack with its leather strap, then ran outside and glanced at the sun that was well on its way to end its day trek. She mounted the bike and within minutes started pedaling up Tall Hill Road. The road went through a dark forest teeming with life, but it didn't bother her with the assurance all of it was a dream. Jane passed an old woman who looked just like the one who had come to her cottage, but she wasn't wearing a half mask. Jane braked and glanced back, but whoever she had seen had disappeared. She wondered if her eyes played tricks on her, and then she pedaled off. Once Jane was out of sight, the old woman emerged again on the road and looked in the direction Jane had pedaled off into. The old woman mumbled to herself, "And so it begins." Large iron gates opened out as Jane rode up to them, and she braked again as she got a sense she wasn't alone. Jane peered through the opening and noticed a path but saw no one there. She thought she was just imagining things just as she imagined she saw the old woman on the road. Jane guessed this was the place she needed to make the delivery to, rode through the gates across a stone path, past a large walled section of the estate she couldn't see into with the sign Hedge Labyrinth, and stopped at the entrance of a castle. Jane dismounted, put her kickstand down, readied the clipboard, walked up to the large wooden doors, grabbed the eagle head knocker, and struck 3 times. The booms rang throughout the castle, and then as she waited for someone to answer the door, she glanced down at the clipboard to see who the delivery was for. Her heart skipped a beat as a torrent of emotions rushed through her when she read the name, The Beast. Whenever she worked on an illustration for one of the versions of the fairy tale, she always got choked up. The tale told of beauty who won over the heart of a cursed prince, and in the end, he won over her heart. No wonder her dream brought her there. Of all the places, this was where her heart belonged. Earlier that day, the Beast walked by a hallway mirror in his castle and reluctantly gazed at his appearance. The grotesqueness of it made him reel from the reflection and quickly head to a different part of the castle. He had to lay his eyes on something else to rid his mind of the horrible image burning within it. The Beast entered a large room void of furniture where paintings of different females hung all about. Each of the portraits was of a beauty and had been painted when they at some point over the years had been a guest of his castle. He gazed at them, partaking of their loveliness until the ugly image of himself was swept from his mind. The beast walked around the many portraits, basking in their exquisite appeal. Each of them had been worthy to be his belle, and even though they were afraid of him when they saw his face, once he hid his appearance from them, his charm gradually won them over. He remembered the last night he spent with each as the offering of their kiss was placed on his desperate lips. Hope had caused his heart to pound rapidly in his chest as he embraced them, but the reality that he had once again been foiled by an unattainable solution brought with it a devastating disappointment, and then an unreasonable disgust. He couldn't bear to look upon them in the flesh again, with his enchantment sadly unbroken. A heavy heart quickly dissolved the charming spell he had over them, and they left his presence forever. The beast couldn't understand what went wrong. Each of these females could have easily been his beauty, and they were all eventually willing. So why couldn't any of these exquisite females break his curse? His stroll turned into a pace as he sought the brush strokes of oil and color, searching for a reason behind the numerous failures. Belle after belle looked back at him with their lovely faces and portrait-sitting smiles. For the first time, he noticed something about each. They were missing something he should have noticed before. He scrutinized the canvases, looking for that trait he missed countless times before on his endless quest to find release from his accursed form. A madness set in as his pace turned into running, and he dashed about the gallery frantic to find the one thing that might free him. He paused at one of the female paintings as the answer finally struck him. It was their lips. He walked from painting to painting as the answer calmed him back to his normal self. It wasn't that their lips were somehow flawed or there was some sort of imperfection in them. It was just, they were all missing an allure. A strong pull that had drawn him in a lifetime ago and caused him to steal something precious. Each of these would-be belles was missing it. If only he had discovered this sooner, he wouldn't have wasted his time with the counterfeit belles and focused on finding his real beauty. The beast paused in the center of the gallery and gazed upon all of them, which was a mixture of princesses, countesses, and other royal maidens. It saddened him that each one had come so close to being his beauty, but a small thing like fleshy brims corrupted the exact elements needed. He was determined not to give up. She had to be out there. He headed out of the gallery and pondered his earlier trip to the mirror. It had been ages since he gazed into it, but a force compelled him to peer into it again as that same force compelled him to visit the gallery. Some sort of magic was at work here, one that gave him a sense that hope had arrived that day. It was hard for him to understand just what kind of sensation possessed him. The best that he could describe it as was that someone precious in his life had been taken away from him a long time ago, and they had mysteriously returned. The beast knew of no such person, so he let those joyous sentiments trickle from his mind as he headed out back. He needed to attend to his daily practice, the present, back at the front of the castle. When no one answered her first attempt, Jane raised her hand to grab the knocker again when a loud commotion from another part of the estate whisked her from her thoughts, and she moved around the castle to find the source. She walked across a grassy lawn and nearly stepped on a small flower. Jane pulled her foot back and then knelt to look at the tiny yellow rose that was no bigger than her pinky. She thought how cute the flower was, and she was tempted to pick it, but then Jane remembered the trouble it caused in the fairy tale. Jane straightened and walked a little further, and then she started to hear frantic clanging, went around a corner, and found an open-air circular structure supported by columns. The structure surrounded a grassy area where a man stood with his back to her, and he wielded a rapier, fighting another rapier. She saw no one else there, so either the man fought a magical sword or an invisible enemy. The duel continued, and then Jane realized the fight was only a practice one for the man with the rapier would pause, retake his stance, and start again with his cuts and lunges. Jane moved to one of the columns drawn forward by an urge to get a glimpse of the man. He had to be him. He had to be the one character that always won her affection no matter what version of his story was told. Jane continued moving until she saw his face, and as she thought, he was the beast, a magnificent, gorgeous beast. He had blonde shoulder-length hair like a lion's mane, blonde fur with patches of brown, cupped lion-like ears, and a lion-like nose. He wore no shirt as he fenced, and a medallion of a beastly creature hung around his neck. The round gold medallion glinted in the sunlight, and she froze as her heart fluttered and a sense of nostalgia hit her. Jane put a hand on the left side of her chest as the muscle pleaded with her to remember something, but her mind refused to give up its locked-away secrets. She wanted to move closer but resisted his allure. She saw how noble and princely his appearance was and how graceful he moved. Jane remembered in his story, Beauty was afraid at first of his cursed appearance, maybe even appalled. Jane couldn't get past how gorgeous he was. She loved the way his mane glimmered in the sun and his ears. She wanted to touch them and rub them like a cat's. Was that wrong of her? Was it wrong of her to think of him like some pet, She decided she wasn't thinking of him in that way. Jane blushed. Far from it. She thought to herself, look at his mouth. Those lips. She rubbed her finger over her own lips. If a kiss was all it took. She hugged the nearby column as she spoke. I'd break his curse any day. Jane put a hand to her mouth. Had she really said that out loud? She looked around, hoping she hadn't said it too loud. Another thought crossed her mind. She just put herself in the role of beauty. Jane laughed at the notion, but then she thought since it was her dream anything was possible. He shall be angry, she heard a male voice speak in a whisper. Jane looked in the direction she had just come from and saw no one. Many stories of the beast included invisible servants, so she thought nothing of it. Why will he be angry? She questioned. Because you have seen him, the invisible servant replied. I am amazed you are not screaming or running away in terror. Could it be that you have poor vision? I can see fine, she told him. And he's the most handsome man I've ever seen. But I can understand not wanting to be spied on. I'll go back to the front of the castle and use the door knocker again. I have a delivery for the beast. The servant said no more to her, so Jane wasn't sure if the servant had left or not. So she headed back to the front of the castle without another word, hoping if she did head right for the servant, he would at least get out of her way. When she reached the corner that would take her away from her magnificent view of the beast, she turned and looked at him once more. He finished his sparring and headed into one of the buildings with what sounded like a few men who must be other invisible servants. When she was nearly back to the front of the castle, Jane saw two people standing just outside the front door. From her distance, she thought they were a woman and a child, but as she walked closer, Jane realized the shorter one was a goblin wearing black armor. The woman with him was tall and very thin with red hair, and she wore a tight-fitting green dress. The woman lifted her hand, which held an emerald cube the size of a Rubik's cube, then spoke some words of enchantment. A wave of magic shot out from the cube, and it covered the castle and all of the estate. The wave of emerald magic washed over Jane and rustled her hair a bit, and then Jane heard several thuds as if a few of the servants, who had been following her, had collapsed to the ground. She didn't feel any different and wondered if it was magic. Why didn't it affect her? The goblin rammed into the front door and forced it open, and then he and the woman went in. Jane rushed to the front door to find it had been shut again and that it was locked or blocked by something, and she couldn't get in. It would appear the beast had some unwelcome guests. Chapter 5. And so it begins. Frantic to help the character who filled her scrapbook, Jane found a side door that wasn't locked, and the door creaked open as she entered a kitchen area. What was left of a fire burned in a hearth where a pot of soup hung cooking. Bowls, utensils, and half-rolled out dough laid on top of a table. She heard angry voices in the distance, moved toward them, bumped the table, and knocked a spoon to the floor. Jane froze, wondering if anyone else heard the clang, but the angry voices never skipped their tempo, so she followed them until she came upon an open door. Did you tie him up good and tight? A female voice questioned. Yes, Mistress Saris. He won't break those bonds, a male voice replied. Jane crept forward until she could peek around the door, and there she saw the female and the goblin. They had the beast tied up in a chair at the head of a long table. The chair had been pulled out a great distance from the table. Jane glanced around the dining room but didn't see anyone else there. The table was fully set as if more than a dozen guests were expected for a party. Tell us. Saris shrieked. Tell us where you've hidden it. The beast growled back at her. I will not tell you. The goblin removed a short sword, and then he yelled, Tell us or I'll gut you. The beast snarled, I will not tell you where the rose is. Cut off a claw, Saris commanded her minion. Maybe a little pain will change his mind. Jane knew she had to do something. This was her dream, so she stepped back from the door, unslung her backpack, removed the club, and stood there wondering exactly what she would do with the weapon. She guessed she would figure that out as she went, so she tiptoed to the door. Jane mustered her courage and then rushed in with the club held high and yelled with all her might. The screaming female startled the enchantress and the goblin, and they shuffled back from the beast. Then they glanced at each other, bewildered by the strange female, and they readied for combat. Jane swung, hitting the goblin on the head, and he hissed at her and swiped his sword. Jane jumped back, evading the blade. The goblin complained to the enchantress, I thought you said your magic would take care of all the servants. I did, Saris replied. I also told you all the servants are invisible. This female is no servant. No matter who she is, I'll get rid of her. The enchantress lifted her hands as she chanted an incantation. The goblin removed a bow he had strung around his chest. Then he pulled a special arrow from the quiver on his back, which looked like to Jane had a small pencil on its end, as an arrowhead, and he knocked the arrow. The beast peered at the female who had her back to him, and that same sensation that drew him to the mirror, and later the gallery came over him again. He tried to see her face, but it eluded him, and then for some reason, he felt that he should save her. So he pressed against his bonds. A franticness overcame him with dread as a sensation that she could be the one leapt into his mind. He roared his frustrations as his arm muscles bulged, and the bonds tensed from his attempt at freedom. He yelled, "Get out of here. This is none of your affair." For the first time, Jane turned and stared into the beast's gaze. His eyes, they were exactly like the ones in her drawings. They were a feral blue-green and full of anger. His anger. She wondered if it was a concern for her or was it something else that brought out his rage. Jane nearly dove head over heels into his gaze if the goblin hadn't have screamed at her. She turned her attention back to the intruders. The beast's heart skipped a beat as the female turned to him. He focused on her lips, and they enthralled him as his thoughts grasped at a memory he'd long forgotten. A sense that he should know her struck him, and he knew without a doubt she was the one. His belle was standing right in front of him. The beast lifted his eyes to gaze into her face, but she turned from him. He continued his struggle to free himself from his bonds, and once he was free, he would save his beauty from the two intruders. Jane lifted the club to attack again just as the goblin pulled back his string and Ceres cast her spell. The emerald magic hit her club and turned the weapon into a viper. The angry reptile snapped at Jane's face, and she threw the poisonous snake at the goblin, and the viper bit his warty nose. The goblin let up on the string and didn't shoot the arrow as he squealed in pain. He dropped the bow and arrow, lifted his arms, and ran about the room with the snake still attached as he yelled, "I'm melting. I'm melting. You aren't melting?" Ceres shouted at him as she readied another spell. The goblin stopped and said in relief, "I'm not." "No," Ceres answered him. "The burning sensation you're feeling is the poison surging through your body. The viper is known as the 8th step." She grinned before she added, "I believe you have taken 7. The goblin's eyes bugged out like pitted olives. His face paled. "And he fell dead?" Ceres stared at him a few seconds, and then she said, "Maybe it was called the 7th step." She shrugged, turned to Jane, and said, "I planned on double-crossing him anyway after we got the rose. You saved me the hassle." Ceres looked her over and then questioned her. "You seem like a worthy adversary. What is your name?" "I'm Jane. I am the enchantress Ceres," she replied and then glanced out the window at the setting sun. "It looks like I did not get the information I needed before the change." "Before what change? Are you a werewolf?" Jane questioned her. "You do not need to worry about that," Ceres told her as she glanced at the emerald cube she held. "I do if you're going to turn into something that's going to bite my head off. I am no werewolf, but do not let your mind be placed at ease. I still intend harm to you." Ceres gave the female a once-over, and then she said, "I do have a feeling you are more than you appear if my magic has no effect on you." She bent, picked up the goblin's bow and arrow, knocked it, drew back the string, and aimed at her as she said, "If I am right, this should kill you. I would have liked to have chatted with you some more, but I have a rose I need to pluck." Jane grabbed a plate from the table to hurl at the lady, but Ceres released the arrow before she threw it. The arrow struck Jane, piercing flesh and bursting her grasp on the reality she believed surrounded her. The wound caused her to drop the plate, and the white china shattered into pieces when it hit the floor as Jane's perception of her dream fragmented into distorted pieces like a funhouse mirror. She looked down at the arrow embedded deep into her flesh. Pain rushed through her body, more pain than she thought possible from a mere pencil. Blood flowed in as the crimson liquid dripped to the floor. Jane came to a horrible conclusion. She wasn't dreaming. The world she stumbled into was as true and real as the one she came from. Jane collapsed to her knees as she looked at the enchantress who laughed at her, gloating over her victory. Jane turned and glanced at the beast. She saw pity in his eyes, the kind of pity one would give to a stray dog who had been killed by a car. And his pity frightened her. She was going to die. She was going to die, and no one would care. Moments earlier, the sun set, taking with it the day, and then the beast beheld the most beautiful thing. He saw what was not always visible, and it lay not that far from those lips that beguiled him with their captivating seduction. He and not the other saw the symbol of what could only be their redemption. The thing he beheld broke the curse of despair and placed hope back in his heart. The female who was trying to save him from the enchantress was also the one who could save him from his affliction. The beast's enthusiasm didn't last long. He witnessed the arrow hit his bell, and then the freedom that was within his grasp faded with each labored breath his would-be savior took. He had to do something. He had to free himself. He had to save this female named Jane. The end. Next. AaBack's Grimm. Dark Fantasy Fairy Tale Number 2. Friends Reunited. The Janus Beast, the Rose Beauty, and the Cursed Duckling.